All right, 70 years ago today, in the shadow of the Second World War, Australia, New Zealand and the United States signed the ANZUS Treaty. It marked the beginning of an unbreakable alliance which has proved fundamental to Australia's security and to peace across the Pacific. Since then, Australians have fought side by side with Americans in Korea, Vietnam and the Middle East, united by a shared commitment to freedom and democracy. And the treaty ratified by the Menzies government has been upheld and renewed by 14 US presidents and 14 Australian Prime Ministers. One of those Prime Ministers, Tony Abbott, joins me now from Sydney. Tony Abbott, thank you for your time. It's an auspicious day. Bob Menzies was initially sceptical, we're told, about the alliance with the United States. It was his Foreign Minister, Percy Spender, who was the driving force behind ANZUS. Of course, upon his retirement, Menzies acknowledged that the treaty was one of his government's most important achievements. If Menzies and Spender were here today, Tony, what would you think they'd have to say about the alliance they forged?
Thanks, Peter. And obviously they'd be proud of their handiwork because the ANZUS Treaty has been the foundation of Australia's security for the past 70 years, and the peace which has been guaranteed through the American century has been that which has enabled us to prosper and live freely and safely over these last decades. Now, the American century, I fear, is now fading into the Asian century, and if the Asian century becomes a Chinese century, we'll be looking at a very, very different future. So let's cleave tight to the American alliance and do what we can to make it even stronger. But let's not for a second underestimate the strategic challenges and indeed the perils that may lie ahead.
Well, just in that vein, I want to ask you about Afghanistan. I mean, I regard it as a real privilege that I was there in, was it October 2013, with you for a ceremony at Tarin Kot before the last of our combat troops left Afghanistan about, 2 months later. You said at the time that Australia's longest war is ending, not with victory, not with defeat, but with, we hope, in Afghanistan that is better for our presence here. Given what we've witnessed over the last 2 weeks, particularly the nature of the withdrawal and the Biden administration, I'm keen on your reflections.
Look, I don't regret our presence in Afghanistan because at least for some 20 years, Afghanistan was a much better country because of American, British, Australian and other allied troops' work. But as always, we've got to look to the future rather than dwell complacently on the past. The future, I fear, will see a resurgence of Islamist militancy with the Taliban now back in charge in Afghanistan, and Afghanistan again potentially a base for terrorism. But as well as an ongoing Islamist challenge, we've got the very, very serious challenge of China, now a full-blown strategic competitor, every bit the military equal of the old Soviet Union, but far more economically strong. And we've got the potential flashpoint of Taiwan, which could develop very, very rapidly indeed. And I fear, Peter, if I might follow on from Jim Molan, who you had on last night, that we are, as a nation, sleepwalking into extremely dangerous and challenging times.
Just down a bit. How's that?
Do you support Senator Molan's view that we've got to have a strategic update, particularly in light of where we are with China, particularly in light, I think, of the loss of prestige with the way in which the US withdrew from Afghanistan?
Yeah.
I think we certainly do need to revise our assumptions, which are being overtaken by events almost on a weekly basis. I do think we do need to think a lot harder and more realistically about the challenges that we face. I fear that we are neither militarily nor mentally prepared for the difficulties ahead. It's common enough for the Prime Minister to rightly say that we are engaged in the largest peacetime naval build-up in our history, but I have to say that it's also the slowest, and frankly, whatever build-up we're now engaged upon, it's too small and too slow, given the strategic challenges which are now obvious.
I'm going to ask you about COVID. I know you're no longer the Prime Minister, but you were once a Health Minister. You were Health Minister in the Howard government, and you drove the implementation of Australia's first ever national pandemic plan. So this is a policy area you are very, very confident and conscious of. No one would deny we've handled the acute phase of the pandemic well, but I tell you, everyone now says we're struggling with the recovery plan. We've fallen into a whole lot of angry states. National Cabinet, I believe, is a failure because it's neutered the role that the Prime Minister could play to bring the Federation together, and all the states are now playing this parochial card, and the federal taxpayer is paying it all off. What needs to happen from here to get us back as one whole country again and open and start to repair the economic damage?
Plainly, Peter, we've got to get vaccinated as quickly as possible because that will relieve the premiers of their excuse for keeping us locked up. Look, I don't say for a second that the pandemic was just a bad flu season. It was always much more serious than that. But my fundamental issue about the way we've handled the pandemic is that we've never seen this really in perspective. We've treated what was essentially a health problem, albeit a serious one, as some kind of overwhelming, overriding national crisis. And while we've been dealing with the pandemic, almost everything else has inevitably been neglected. We have got to be able to think about more than one issue at a time if we are going to be as successful in the near future as we have long been in the past. And that's the challenge that all of us have, to try to ensure that the Australia our children live in is even better than the one we've lived through. But I fear all of us, in a sense, have got to lift our game if that's to be the case.
Are you surprised at how quickly freedom has been eroded, how quickly government took our freedoms from us and how quickly many of us let those freedoms go?
To be honest, it has been both a little surprising and a little disconcerting, Peter. Obviously, we do sometimes have to surrender elements of our freedom in a very good cause, but it's hard not to think that we haven't been locked down too hard, too long, especially this year, given that really quite early on, certainly from about May or June, all of the most vulnerable in nursing homes have been pretty much fully vaccinated.
Tony Abbott, thank you for your time. Great to have your insights on all of those things.
As always, Peter.